Welcome to Tranquility, a podcast dedicated to slowing down, quieting the noise of the day, and helping you find a sense of peace. I'm John Coverstone, and each episode is a gentle invitation to unwind. Whether you're settling in for the night, taking a moment to breathe, or simply looking for a calm space in your day. So find a comfortable place, let your thoughts drift, and allow yourself to relax. This is Tranquility. Long before the sun reached the windows of the Lock House, Thomas Henshaw could hear the canal moving beyond the garden wall. It was never completely still, even in the hour before dawn. Water pressed softly against the lower gates, slipped through narrow spaces in the timber, and gathered beneath the overhanging grass along the bank. The sound was quiet enough to disappear beneath conversation during the day, but in the early morning, when the towpath lay empty and the nearest village had not yet begun to stir, it filled the little house with a low and steady murmur. Thomas had listened to it for more than 40 years. He knew the canal in rain and in heat, beneath winter ice and under the pale green shade of early summer. He knew how it sounded after a night of heavy weather, when the water carried small branches and leaves against the gates, and how it sounded during long dry weeks, when the level dropped and the stones beside the lock began to show above the surface. He could tell from his bed when a mooring rope had worked loose, when a duck had entered the narrow spillway, or when the lower gates were allowing a little more water through than they ought. This morning the canal sounded settled. Thomas opened his eyes and looked toward the window. The curtains were faintly gray around the edges, and the room still held the coolness of night. Somewhere beneath the eaves, a sparrow shifted in its nest. The old clock on the mantel gave a restrained click as the minute hand advanced. He remained beneath the blanket for a little while longer. There was no need to hurry. The first boat was not expected until 7, and Thomas had never required much time to prepare for the day. His clothes were folded on the chair beside the bed. His boots waited at the foot of the stairs. The kettle had been filled the previous evening, and 2 pieces of kindling rested beside the kitchen stove. Even so, he rose before the clock reached 5:30. Habit had woken him at the same hour through most of his adult life, and there seemed little reason to argue with it now. He dressed in a collarless shirt, dark trousers, and a wool waistcoat that had been repaired so neatly at one shoulder that the mending was almost invisible. Before leaving the bedroom, he opened the curtains. A thin band of light had appeared above the eastern fields. From the upper window, Thomas could see the length of the lock, the white painted beams of the gates, and the narrow ribbon of towpath continuing between hedges toward the next bend. Mist rested lightly upon the water. It drifted in soft patches, revealing one dark reflection and then concealing another, as though the canal were remembering the sky gradually. Beyond the lower gates, a family of moorhens moved through the reeds. The chicks followed close behind the adults, each leaving a faint line upon the surface. Thomas watched until they disappeared beneath willow branches. Then he went downstairs. The Lock House had only 4 rooms, but it had never seemed small to him. The kitchen occupied most of the lower floor, with a black iron stove, a scrubbed wooden table, and shelves holding plain white crockery. A narrow sitting room opened from it, furnished with 2 armchairs, a bookcase, and a desk where Thomas kept the lock records. Upstairs were the bedroom and a second room that had once belonged to his daughter, years before she married and moved to a town beyond the hills. The walls were thick, and the windows were deep enough to hold small pots of herbs. Rosemary grew in one, mint in another. During winter, when frost patterned the panes, the kitchen remained warm long after the fire had burned low. Thomas knelt beside the stove and arranged the kindling. The flame caught easily. Soon the iron began to creak with returning heat, and the kettle made a small settling sound as he placed it above the fire. While the water warmed, he opened the back door. Cool air entered the kitchen, scented with damp earth, reeds, and the faint mineral smell of the stone lock walls. The garden was narrow and well kept. Beans climbed a frame near the wall. A row of cabbages filled the far bed, and a pear tree leaned through the roof as though seeking warmth from the chimney. Thomas crossed the grass and opened the gate onto the towpath. The canal lay almost level with its upper reach. Its surface reflected the brightening sky so clearly that the banks appeared to continue downward into another landscape. Only the occasional circle left by a rising fish disturbed the illusion. He walked first to the upper gates. The timber was dark with moisture. Thomas rested one hand upon the balance beam and felt the familiar roughness beneath his palm. A dozen coats of paint had softened the grain in some places, while years of weather had opened it again in others. The gates were older than he was, though parts had been replaced many times. Timber renewed, hinges reforged, paddles repaired. Nothing remained entirely unchanged, yet the gate still seemed to possess a single continuous life. He inspected the collars, checked the chains, and looked along the water line for anything caught against the wood. A few willow leaves had gathered near the sill. Thomas drew them away with a boat hook and left them floating in the upper reach, where the current carried them slowly toward the bank. He followed the locked chamber downward. The stone walls were damp and cool. Ferns grew in the joints near the top, their fronds bending over the emptying marks left by passing boats. Iron ladders descended at intervals toward the water. Thomas checked each one, although he had checked them the previous evening and knew they were sound. At the lower gates, he found nothing requiring attention. He stood there for a while, looking downstream. The mist had begun to thin. A rook flew from one field to another, its wings moving slowly above the hedgerow. Far beyond the bend, a horse gave a single low call, and another answered from somewhere near the village. The canal waited between them. Thomas turned back toward the house as the church clock struck 6. Breakfast was bread toasted against the stove, a boiled egg, and tea from the brown pot he had used for nearly 30 years. He ate at the kitchen table with the door still open, watching sunlight gather along the garden wall. Beside his plate lay a folded envelope. It had arrived 3 weeks earlier from the Canal office. Thomas didn't need to open it again. He knew every line of the letter, not because he had studied it closely, but because its meaning had settled gradually into the rooms around him. His retirement would begin the following morning. The new keeper, a young man named Samuel Pike, would arrive shortly after 8 to take possession of the records, keys, tools, and lockhouse. Thomas would move that afternoon to a cottage nearer his daughter's family, where there was another garden and a smaller stream crossing the field behind the lane. The arrangements had been made carefully. His daughter had written several times to say how pleased the grandchildren were that he would be closer. Samuel had visited twice, and Thomas had found him quiet, attentive, and respectful of the work. The canal superintendent had assured him that he could remain in the house as long as necessary, but Thomas had already packed nearly everything. 3 wooden crates stood beneath a sheet in the sitting room. The books were boxed. The good crockery was wrapped. Clothing hung ready in a traveling case upstairs. Only the things needed for this final day remained in their usual places. Thomas finished his tea without looking again at the letter. Retirement was not something he feared, nor was it something he celebrated. It was simply the next bend in a route he could not see beyond, much like the canal where it disappeared between the willow trees. There was no need to imagine the entire journey at once. Say that over again. I feel like that should have been a little more final. There was no need to imagine the entire journey at once. At 10 minutes before 7, he washed the breakfast dishes and placed them on the rack to dry. Then he took his cap from the hook beside the door and walked out to wait for the first boat. He heard it before he saw it. A slow engine note drifted through the morning, accompanied by the soft rhythm of water parting beneath a narrow bow. Smoke rose above the hedge at the bend, followed by the painted cabin roof of a working boat. The boat was called Marigold. Thomas knew it by the red and yellow roses painted around the cabin doors, though the colors had faded since they were first applied. It carried sacks of grain toward the mills 3 locks downstream and made the journey twice each week. At the tiller stood Henry Cole, broad-shouldered and gray-bearded, wearing the same dark cap he had worn for as long as Thomas could remember. His wife, Ada, emerged from the cabin carrying a tin mug. "Morning, Tom," Henry called. "Morning. Fine day for it." "It appears to be." Ada lifted her mug toward him. "We wondered whether we'd be the first." "You are." The boat approached the landing stage at walking pace. Henry reversed the engine briefly, and the stern moved gently toward the bank. Thomas took the rope Ada passed him and looped it once around the bollard. The sequence that followed had been repeated so many times that the 3 of them moved through it with very few words. Thomas crossed to the lower gates and pushed against the long balance beam. The gate resisted for a moment before beginning its slow arc across the stone. Water folded around its lower edge. The second gate followed, opening the lock chamber to the boat. Henry guided Marigold inside. The engine dropped to a low murmur, and Ada stepped onto the roof to keep the cabin from brushing the wall. Thomas closed the lower gates behind them, drew the paddles, and allowed water from the upper reach to enter the chamber. At first, the flow was hardly visible. Then pale currents curled beneath the boat, carrying small pieces of foam toward the stern. The water rose slowly, lifting Marigold with such steadiness that the boat appeared to remain still while the stone walls descended around it. Thomas watched the ropes. Henry rested one hand upon the tiller. Ada sat in the cabin roof with her tea, looking across the field where sunlight had begun to reach the tops of the hedges. "There were kingfishers near Blackwood Bridge yesterday," she said. "2 of them?" "3." Thomas looked toward the reeds below the garden wall. "We had a pair nesting here in spring." "I saw them once," Henry said, "faster than a thought." The water continued rising. A wren moved through the hawthorn beside the lock, too small to bend even the thinnest branches. Its song seemed far larger than the bird itself, filling the space between the house and the canal before ending abruptly. Ada smiled. "You'll miss that sound." Thomas looked toward her. Word had traveled then. News moved along canals at much the same pace as the boats, but it rarely failed to arrive. "I expect I will," he said. Henry glanced up from the tiller. "Tomorrow, is it?" "Tomorrow." For a few moments, the only sound was water filling the chamber. Then Henry nodded. "You've kept a good lock." It was a simple statement, offered without ceremony. Thomas accepted it in the same manner. "Thank you." The water reached the upper level. He lowered the paddles, crossed the narrow footbridge, and opened the gates. Marigold moved forward. Ada stepped down from the roof and disappeared briefly into the cabin. When she returned, she carried a small loaf wrapped. Lots of edits here. When she returned, she carried a small loaf wrapped in cloth. "Baked this morning," she said. "There's a little honey in it." Thomas received it as the boat passed. "That's kind of you." "You've opened this lock for us in every sort of weather," Henry said. "A loaf seems little enough." The boat continued into the upper reach, its engine deepening as Henry increased the speed. Ada turned and raised one hand. Thomas stood beside the gate until Marigold passed around the bend. The widening wake touched both banks, returned to the center, and slowly diminished into lines of light. He carried the loaf into the house and placed it on the table. Then he returned to close the gates. The morning proceeded without hurry. A pleasure boat came through shortly after 8, hired by a family who had never operated a lock before. Thomas explained where to stand, how to hold the ropes, and why the paddles should be raised gradually rather than all at once. The children watched the water with great seriousness, while their father apologized each time the boat touched the wall. "No harm done," Thomas told him. "Boats and walls expect to meet occasionally." At 9, a pair of cyclists stopped to refill their water bottles at the outdoor tap. One asked how far the towpath continued. "All the way to the sea, in one manner or another," Thomas said. The cyclists laughed, though Thomas had meant it plainly. Near 10, Samuel Pike arrived on foot from the village. He was a tall young man, with careful movements and a habit of listening without preparing his answer too early. Thomas had noticed that quality during their first meeting and approved of it. Samuel wore a clean work shirt and carried a notebook beneath one arm. "Good morning, Mr. Henshaw." "Samuel, I hope I'm not intruding." "You're here to learn the lock. It would be difficult." I'll go back to here. "You're here to learn the lock. It would be difficult to intrude upon it." Samuel smiled and followed him toward the upper gate. For the next hour they walked slowly around the grounds while Thomas explained the details that did not appear in the official handbook. The upper paddle on the towpath side tended to stiffen after prolonged rain. The lower gate collar required oil twice as often as the others. The willow roots near the spillway should be checked each spring. The lock chamber appeared to drain fully, but a shallow shelf beneath the offside wall would catch floating timber. Samuel wrote each item in his notebook. "There's a spare windlass in the shed," Thomas said. "The iron one, not the brass-handled one. The brass is cracked." "I remember." "The level gauge reads 1/2 an inch high." Samuel looked up. "Should it be replaced?" "No, once you know it reads high, it becomes accurate again." They continued toward the garden. Thomas showed him the stop planks stacked beneath the lean-to and the long rake used to clear reeds from the culvert. He explained where the frost formed first in winter and which section of the towpath became slippery after leaf fall. Samuel recorded everything. At the garden gate, they paused. "You needn't keep the cabbages," Thomas said. They'll be ready within a fortnight." "I'd like to keep them." "The beans as well?" "Yes." Thomas nodded. That seemed sensible. They stood beside the pear tree, listening as a boat engine sounded distantly downstream. Samuel closed the notebook. "Does it feel strange?" Thomas considered the question. "Today does not," he said. Tomorrow, May. Samuel looked toward the lock. I'll take good care of it. I believe you will. The boat engine grew louder. Thomas turned toward the canal. You can operate this one. Samuel placed his notebook in his pocket. The approaching boat was a small cabin cruiser with white curtains at the windows and a blue enamel kettle tied beside the chimney. An elderly couple stood at the stern. They greeted Thomas by name, but accepted Samuel's guidance without concern. Thomas remained nearby while the young keeper worked. Samuel opened the gates correctly, closed them without slamming the beams, and raised the paddles in careful stages. He watched the boat rather than the machinery, which Thomas considered a good sign. Locks were built of timber, iron, stone, and water, but their purpose was to carry people safely from one level to another. A keeper who watched only the gears had forgotten half the work. When the boat departed, Samuel reset the lock for the next passage. Well, he said, you rushed the final paddle. Samuel nodded. I thought I did. Only slightly. I'll remember. You will. They returned to the house for tea. Thomas cut the honey loaf Ada had given him. The crumb was dense and golden, and the sweetness remained lightly on the tongue without overwhelming the bread. Samuel ate 2 slices. As they sat at the kitchen table, Thomas spoke about winter routines, flood notices, and the procedure for reporting damaged masonry. The conversation remained practical, but beneath it ran an understanding that the knowledge of one keeper was passing quietly into the keeping of another. Nothing needed to be declared. At noon, Samuel left for the Canal office. Thomas watched him cross the footbridge and continue along the towpath toward the village. The young man's steps were steady. He did not turn around, and Thomas was glad of it. The afternoon grew warmer. Sunlight rested upon the canal, turning the reflected leaves into broad, shifting patches of green and gold. Dragonflies moved above the reeds. A horse grazed in the field beyond the hedge, its tail brushing lazily at flies. There were no boats for nearly 2 hours. Thomas used the quiet interval to clean the tool shed. Most of the work had already been done during the previous week, but he found small tasks that had escaped him. A coil of rope needed hanging. 2 oil cans required wiping. A drawer contained several bent nails, a broken hinge, 3 washers of different sizes, and a key that no longer belonged to any lock he could identify. He placed the useful objects in their proper compartments and carried the rest to a bucket beside the door. The shed smelled of timber, hemp, and machine oil. Sunlight entered through a narrow gap in the wall, illuminating the handles of the tools Thomas I'll get it. Sunlight entered through a narrow gap in the wall, illuminating the handles of the tools Thomas had used through countless seasons. He ran one hand along the shaft of the long boat hook. There had been a winter many years earlier when the entire upper reach froze so firmly that children from the village skated from the bridge to the lock. Thomas had broken the ice near the gates each morning, not because boats were expected, but because the pressure against the timbers could become dangerous if left too long. Another year, summer heat lowered the canal until every passage required careful management of water. Boatmen waited beneath the trees while Thomas balanced the levels between reaches. No one hurried because there was nowhere for speed to go. There had been storms, fogs, nesting swans, broken paddles, lost dogs, and one escaped cow that crossed the footbridge with surprising confidence. Most days, however, had been ordinary. Thomas valued them most. Ordinary days had filled the greatest part of his life, not as empty spaces between memorable events, but as the substance from which memory itself was made. Tea beside the stove, wet footprints on the kitchen floor, rope sliding across a bollard, the first cuckoo in spring, the final boat moving through at dusk. He closed the shed door and walked to the lower gates. The water below the lock reflected an almost cloudless sky. Near the bank, minnows gathered in the shade of the reeds, their movements flashing silver beneath the surface. Thomas sat on the balance beam. He rarely sat there during working hours, though he had often done so as a younger man while eating lunch between boats. The timber felt warm beneath him. From this position, the lock house appeared partly hidden by the garden wall. Smoke rose thinly from the chimney. The pear tree moved above the roofline. A shirt he had washed the previous day remained on the line, stirring gently in the breeze. Tomorrow, the house would belong to Samuel. That thought produced no sharp sorrow. Instead, Thomas felt a quiet loosening, as though a rope long kept under proper tension had finally been laid upon the ground. The house had never truly belonged to him, nor had the lock, the garden, or the stretch of water passing between the fields. He had cared for them. That was different. Care did not require ownership. Perhaps it meant something better. Shortly after 2, another working boat arrived, followed by a second traveling in company. Thomas passed them through together, fitting both narrow holes side by side within the chamber. The boatmen spoke of market prices, a damaged bridge farther north, and a heron seen standing on the roof of a toll house. One of them, a woman named Margaret Shaw, had known Thomas since she was a child traveling aboard her parents' boat. "You'll come visit the canal?" she asked as the water rose. "I expect so." "You'd better. We'll need someone to tell the new keeper what he's doing wrong." "Samuel will do well." "That doesn't prevent advice." Thomas smiled. When the boats reached the upper level, Margaret placed a small tin upon the lock wall. "For your tea," she said. Inside were 6 biscuits dusted with sugar. By mid-afternoon, the news had clearly traveled farther than Thomas imagined. A gardener from the estate brought apples. The village schoolmaster stopped during his walk and gave Thomas a book about river birds. Mrs. Bell from the bakery arrived with a jar of blackberry preserve and insisted upon placing it directly in the kitchen cupboard. No one stayed long, and no one made a speech. They offered small gifts, exchanged a few words, and continued along their way, leaving Thomas to the lock in the sunlight and the low passage of water. He preferred it so. At 5, the shallow of the willow reached across the towpath. Thomas made tea and carried it outside with one of Margaret's biscuits. He sat on the bench beneath the kitchen window, where he could see both the upper reach and the garden. The canal had taken on the softer color of evening. Reflections lengthened. The far bank appeared darker beneath the trees, while the center of the water held a pale band of sky. A kingfisher passed. It emerged from beneath the willow, blue and copper, moving so swiftly that it seemed less like a bird than a fragment of color released into the air. It crossed the lock, disappeared above the lower reach, and left the scene unchanged except for the knowledge that it had been there. Thomas drank his tea. He wondered whether Ada had seen the same bird farther downstream, or whether this was one of the pair that nested near the spillway. There would be time to ask when he next saw her. That realization pleased him. Retirement was not disappearance. The canal would remain calm. The boats would continue their routes. Thomas could walk the towpath without carrying keys in his pocket, or watching every approaching bow with professional attention. He might hear water simply as water. The idea seemed unfamiliar, but not unwelcome. As the sun lowered, the final scheduled boat appeared from the upper reach. It was a small, narrow boat, painted deep green, carrying no cargo beyond household goods stacked beneath a canvas sheet. At the tiller stood a man Thomas did not recognize. A woman sat near the cabin doorway, knitting something from pale wool. They were traveling south. "Will we reach Bell's Wharf before dark?" the man asked. "You should," Thomas said. "The next lock is open until 8. He prepared the chamber. The green boat entered slowly. Its name, quietly, was painted in cream letters along the cabin. Thomas found the name appropriate. The woman continued knitting while the water descended. Her hands moved with an easy regularity, drawing each loop through the next as the boat sank gradually between the stone walls. The man at the tiller looked toward the lockhouse. "Been here long?" 41 years. The man gave a low whistle. "You must know every stone." Not everyone. Most of them, then. Most. The boat settled toward the lower level. Evening light reached into the chamber at a shallow angle, illuminating moss upon the walls and the thin streams of water draining from the joints. The air smelled cool and damp below the lock edge. When the levels matched, Thomas opened the lower gates. The man engaged the engine. The woman looked up from her knitting. "Thank you." Thomas nodded. Quietly moved into the lower reach. Its wake spread against the banks, lifting the reeds and setting the reflections in motion. The boat continued toward the bend, where the last sunlight touched the cabin roof before it disappeared beneath the trees. Thomas watched until the sound of the engine faded. There might be an unscheduled boat later, a traveler delayed upstream, a maintenance craft, or a pleasure boat whose crew had misjudged the distance between moorings. But he did not think so. The canal had the feeling of a day completed. He closed the lower gates. The beams moved beneath his hands with familiar weight. The first gate met the sill, and the second followed until the timbers pressed together at the center. Thomas lowered the paddles, checked the chains, and walked along the lock chamber toward the upper reach. He didn't hurry. At each point, he paused as he had paused every evening, beside the ladder, the gauge, the upper paddle gear, and the worn stone where generations of ropes had left shadow. I completely messed up the cadence on that. At each point, he paused as he had paused every evening, beside the ladder, the gauge, the upper paddle gear, and the worn stone where generations of ropes had left shallow grooves. He tested the gate collar, clearing a twig from the spillway, and returned the windlass to its hook. The light continued fading. A coolness entered the air from the fields. The first bats moved above the water, turning with silent precision as they followed insects along the bank. Thomas crossed the upper gate and stood at the center of a narrow footbridge. From there he could see both directions. Upstream, the canal reflected the remaining light between dark hedges. Downstream, the water disappeared beneath willow branches and followed the departing boat toward the next lock. Behind him, the lock house windows shone with the warm light of the kitchen lamp. He placed one hand in his pocket and felt the ring of keys. The brass edges had worn smooth. One key opened the shed, another the paddle locks. A smaller one belonged to the record cabinet. The largest opened the front door of the house. Tomorrow he would give them to Samuel. Tonight, they remained his responsibility. Thomas listened to the water. The lock had reached equilibrium. No boat displaced the surface. No paddle drew a current through the chamber. The ripples left by quietly had vanished, and the canal rested between the gates with a stillness so complete that the first evening star appeared clearly in the reflection. He had seen the same sight hundreds of times, yet not precisely this one. The sky was never identical. The water never held the same leaves. No bird crossed at exactly the same height or vanished into the same part of the hedge. Habit had brought Thomas to the bridge each evening, but the evening itself had always arrived new. Mr. Bell had once said something similar about baking bread. The work repeated, but the days surrounding it changed. Thomas understood that better now. He crossed the towpath and began his final inspection. The walk carried him a quarter-mile upstream to the nearest bridge. He checked the bank for erosion, examined the mooring posts, and lifted a fallen branch from the path. At the bridge, he rested his arms upon the stone parapet and looked back toward the lock. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin, straight line. The white gate beams remained visible in the dusk. I feel like The white gate beams remained visible in the dusk. Beyond them, the fields had softened into broad shapes beneath the deepening sky. A train sounded far away. The note traveled across the countryside, lingering above the fields before fading toward the hills. Thomas turned homeward. His boots made little sound upon the packed earth. Long grasses leaned over the canal edge, their seed heads brushing one another whenever the breeze moved through. Frogs had begun calling from a drainage ditch near the hedge. Somewhere among the reeds, a water bird settled with a brief rustle and then became quiet. At the garden gate, Thomas paused beside the pear tree. One fruit hung low above the wall, nearly ripe. He cupped it gently in his hand and felt that it would need another day or two. Samuel could have it. Inside, the kitchen retained the warmth of the stove. Thomas closed the back door, drew the curtain, and placed the kettle over the fire. He prepared a simple supper of cheese, bread, and one of the apples left by the estate gardener. The apple was crisp and slightly sharp, just as he liked it. He ate without lighting the brighter lamp. The small flame above the stove was sufficient. It illuminated the table, the brown teapot, and the 3 crates waiting beneath the sheet in the sitting room. Beyond that circle of light, the house rested quietly. When the meal was finished, Thomas washed the plate and set it on the rack. He carried the lock records to the desk. The final entry required only a few lines. Traffic, 6 boats. Water level, normal. Weather, fine. Equipment, in good order. He paused before the last space, where additional remarks could be recorded. Then he wrote, "Lock secured at sunset." He blotted the ink and closed the book. For several minutes, Thomas remained at the desk, with one hand resting upon the worn cover. The records held years of weather, repairs, water levels, and passing craft. Let's see that one more time. The records held years of weather, repairs, water levels, and passing craft. They contained no account of the conversations beside the gates, the tea shared with boatmen, or the mornings when mist covered the upper reach. Such things belonged elsewhere. Perhaps nowhere except memory. That was enough. He rose and checked the stove. Before going upstairs, he opened the back door one last time. Night had settled over the canal. The water was nearly black beneath the trees, though it still held a narrow reflection of sky through the center. The lock gates stood in silhouette. A lamp glowed at the distant bridge where someone crossed slowly from one bank to the other. Thomas stepped into the garden. The air was cool against his face. Mint and damp earth scented the darkness. Above the roof, stars appeared between thin clouds, unhurried and clear. Tomorrow Samuel would wake in the lock house now. Tomorrow Samuel would wake in the lock house and listen for the canal. He would make his own tea. That's right. Okay, Samuel. Yeah. Tomorrow Samuel would wake in the lock house and listen for the canal. He would make his own tea, inspect the gates, and learn which sounds required attention and which belonged simply to the water. In time, his boots would shape themselves to the towpath. His hands would remember the weight of the beams. He would begin to recognize boats from their engine notes before they came around the bend. The lock would teach him. Thomas had once imagined that he spent 41 years learning the canal. Now he understood that the canal had also taught him how to live beside it. It had shown him that progress need not be fast to be certain, that raising or lowering anything of weight required patience, that gates sometimes had to close before the water could become calm enough to carry someone forward. Most of all, it had taught him that care was made from small acts repeated faithfully, often without notice and rarely without value. A breeze passed over the garden wall. The reeds bent and rose again. Thomas closed the door, turned the key, and returned it to the ring in his pocket. Upstairs, the bed waited beside the fairly open window. He undressed, folded his clothes upon the chair, and placed the keys on the table where he would find them in the morning. The mantel clock below marked 10. The house became still. Thomas lay beneath the blanket and listened. Water pressed softly against the gates, slipped through the narrow spaces in the timber, and gathered beneath the overhanging grass along the bank. A moorhen called once from the reeds. The pear branches brushed lightly against the roof. Nothing had ended. The canal was moving quietly through the darkness, carrying the reflected stars toward the next bend and onward beneath bridges Thomas could not see. For one final night, the lock rested in his keeping. Thomas closed his eyes. The water continued on. Thank you for spending this quiet time with me. If you enjoyed the story, I hope you'll join me again for another moment of tranquility. For now, may this peaceful feeling stay with you as you drift off to sleep or continue to enjoy your time of relaxation. Until next time.